Well, listen, hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm David Gersten. I'm the Director of Arts, Letters, and Numbers, and I want to welcome you all to today's event, conversation. This program is part of an ongoing series of projects titled Theaters of Arch Imagination, and that's part of our Sonship exhibition in the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale. And I really want to thank Lisa Landrum for all that she's bringing to this exhibition. It's an incredible series of projects. I love these projects. And I think it's really exactly what we hoped when we set this out, to sort of broaden the spectrum of the spatial imagination that is understood as architecture. And I think it's fantastic to start this series with Sonic Trails Lockdown. Thank you, Max and Orion Sandred, for this. You know, as we all continue to live in the challenges of this rupture, I think finding new ways to imagine it, finding new ways to understand it is really crucial creative work. And the sounds of our lockdown, this is a remarkable perception of the entire situation. So I just want to thank you all. Thank you for coming. And now I'm going to pass it on to Lisa, who will begin the program.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. And I did just put the live stream link in the Zoom chat for anyone who hasn't found that already. So David Gersten, thank you very much for your generous invitation to join this exchange on architecture as a life-sustaining discipline, and for your call to all of us really to seize learning as a transformative and restorative pursuit. You know, as you say, galvanizing our social contracts and fusing horizons of arts and sciences, prospects, and promises. So I am going to share screen here very briefly for an introduction. So I'm grateful to participate in this arc of discovery, the sonship of friendship, as it's been called, as part of the City X Italian Pavilion of the Venice Architecture Biennale, which asks, how will we all live together? And I like the emphasis here on the will, because this question of living together, I think, is a question of willing, of volition, of choice, of vision, and desire. And we'll be hearing more about the motive of desire shortly. So one of the ways we will live together is through renewed forms of collaboration, and the Sonship team, David, Adrianos, Duin, and others have modeled this collective through global teamwork, and they are indeed spanning across the globe. So I am speaking to you from Winnipeg at the center of Turtle Island here, otherwise known as North America. These are the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Now, one way we will live together, particularly in Canada, is by acknowledging the roots of situations and acting in partnership with Indigenous communities moving forward. So my own research digs into the roots of archi, the archi of architecture and architectural imagination, recognizing architecture as a discipline concerned with originary acts and dramatic agencies of renewal, beginning, and beginning again. So as David mentioned, this is the first of 5 acts toward renewed practices and architectural imaginaries, integrating sonic, mythic, poetic, heuristic, and dramatic arts. So today we'll hear from musical artist and future architect Max Sandred and composer and music professor Orion Sandred, in conversation with Harvard-based experimental composer Hans Huchko. But before we get there, I just want to give a little anecdote as to the roots of this archi imagination collaboration. So in January of 2020, it's a whole year and a half ago, pre-pandemic, in January 2020, I was fortunate to connect with architecture student Max Sandred. I was preparing for this Fiscari 5 symposium on theaters of architectural imagination, co-hosted with Sam Ridgway, Louise Peltier, and Alberto Perez Gomez. And Max, with the support of a research award, was going to help me with a related in-person exhibition in Montreal that summer. When COVID canceled the exhibition and postponed the conference, which happened just this past May, our research in the summer of 2020 turned to studying multimedia stagings and questions about mediation in theater. So inspired by artists, including the Czech scenographer Josef Sobota, Max designed, tested, and really kind of invented his own theater of architectural imagination. The exhibition that we originally planned evolved into an online exhibition of short videos, which we called Entr'actes, and these are still available on the UCOM Design Center website, thanks to Louise Pelletier. And these Entr'actes, these 2-minute videos, were staged as provocative episodes in between the paper sessions at the Foscari 5 symposium. And here's a taste of those Entr'actes. And this was a trailer of the Entr'actes made by Max Sandrid. So there were contributions in these Entr'actes from around the world, as well as 4 other students from the University of Manitoba, Jonathan Lum, Ralph Gutierrez, who's on the call, Sean Vander Kerkhoff, and Andrea Lange, as well as a Winnipeg-based team submission from End of the West Collective, whose performance of Janus is Act 5 of this Archi-Imagination series. So these archi-theatrical ideas were elaborated this summer through multiple meetings with a remarkable student team, including Max, Saba Reza, Alexa Lacerna, and Andrea Lange. And Andrea Lange, her presentation of Mythic Ba, a fusion of flood myths for the Sunship, is Act 2 of this series 2 weeks from today. So now returning to Act 1, I am going to stop sharing my screen and invite Orion to begin sharing his screen, and we will take you in to the backstage and technical details of Sonic Trails Lockdown, and to the questions of what is the pulse of a city when its citizens go silent, and what are the city's scenes and rhythms when its cycles spin free of human presence. So Orion Sandrid is a Swedish-born composer and professor of music here at the University of Manitoba's Des Hôtels Faculty of Music, where he founded Studio Flat, an experimental research studio for electroacoustic music and computer-assisted composition. His compositions have been commissioned by ensembles around the world, and his research, which is shared through seminars and lectures globally, explores the impact of technology in the arts. So Orion, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this introduction. And thank you for inviting us to this context. And also thank you to Arts, Letters and Numbers. Of course, I'm David. It's fantastic to be in for me, a new context, because my context is normally within the music stage. And now being in different settings gives a lot of impulses. And I think this sharing of experiences through the different disciplines are very fruitful and very important. So I really appreciate that this has been possible. I'm going to start off with, see if I can share my screen. Let's see, just have to go to Zoom. And here we go. You see a picture there, I think. Okay, so I'll take you back to January 2020, which is the origin of this installation, Sonic Trails. It was a different rendering of the installation. This time in 2020, it was pure a sonic installation, and it was set up at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights that's located here in Winnipeg. And as you can see on the picture here, it's in this very beautiful garden of contemplation they have in the center of the museum. We have or had 4 speakers around a bench, basically, and people were invited to sit and listen. And the idea was to present soundscapes from different environments around Winnipeg. And by having this very realistic soundscape, make people recognize where they are, so to speak, and then slowly pull them into an unknown landscape, which is far more abstract, to kind of paint the inner beauty of the sounds that they already know from their everyday life. So this play with reality and more abstract version of reality was very much in the center of the concept of this installation. I have a little image. This is a poster that Max made me for the event, and it kind of paints the realistic birds on the bottom there with the backdrop, which is actually a more abstract version of the image itself. So, and this is of course nothing new. I mean, we can go back easily to the 1950s in electronic music, where Pierre Schaeffer in France, of course, built his ideas around the idea of now when we can record sounds, we can include any sound in music. And the struggle he had, so to speak, with doing that was that if you play a sound that people are familiar with, they will think about what caused the sounds. If you play a sound of a bird, people will think about the bird. If you play a sound of a car, they will think about the car. But he was aiming for the inner beauty of the sound. So he in his ideal way of listening to sounds, it should be that you forget that you're actually listening to a car. You should instead listening to the qualities and what's inside the sound. So he had a very important research in the 50s, 60s around this and the classification of sound objects, as he speaks about. So of course, my way of talking about the abstract and the realistic way of listening to sounds definitely owe to him and his way of looking at sounds. And of course, there's a lot of things happened since the 1950s, how this has been discussed, but I think it's an important foundation for this way of thinking. My research has circled around a lot of how to use technology in music. And I have specifically been interested in using artificial intelligence in my work. And I've done it for many years in my creative work, in the creative process, to help me reflect on the material I work with and how to deal with it. So I don't see any purpose of artificial intelligence, so to speak, to take over the creative process, rather to reflect on it and give me feedback on things I would never have thought about. I think one of my favorite quotes is from Brian Eno, who said that there's a fantastic feature of computers. There's one really good feature of computers, and that's that they are so extremely stupid. And they make me think about things I would never have come up myself. And I really agree with that. You know, you wouldn't go in certain directions without having this completely naive way of looking at things that a machine could, in the good scenario, do for you. So the image I have here on the screen is trying to illustrate how the installation evolves from soundscape to soundscape, so to speak. And the way that happens is driven by these algorithms from artificial intelligence. So in this particular work, it's more than using artificial intelligence in the creative process. This is actually in the performance. So the installation is performing by itself. And my challenge was to try to make sense out of this and make it create music, so to speak. So you come back to a very fundamental question: what is music? You know, in terms of more than sound. Of course, music is based on sound, but it's much more than that. Of course, it's how we hear sound, how it evolves. You know, how do you create form, etc. One of the most important factor in music, of course, is that it's driven by time, and in a way, we sculpt time with music in a very abstract way. And if you don't create a very clear structure, you will lose your listener very, very fast. So that is part of the challenge I took on by using these algorithms for doing this. So I find it quite fascinating, actually, to try to define and formalize intellectually for myself what that would mean, so to speak. This is the image from what it looks like inside the computer for Sonic Trails Lockdown now. This is the patch or the computer program that sends out instructions for what will happen to the sound, what will happen in the image. And there's a lot of incomprehensible text here in green in the middle. It's not meant to be read by a human. These are instructions with parameters in settings in other part of the computer that will process the sound or process the image or make choices for what images you see. So this is kind of we could call it the brain in the whole setup of computers. Of course, I tend to, the way I work with artificial intelligence, I would say that I think it's more artificial than intelligent, which brings in a completely different discussion. Of course, I shouldn't go there, but to understand that artificial intelligence might not in the first place be about intelligence. It's more about structuring data or something like that. Of course, it's very hard to define what artificial intelligence would be when we can hardly define what natural intelligence is. So it's very, very tricky in that philosophical way, but very, very fascinating at the same time, I think. So how is then this sound world evolving? So I'm speaking about the sound first, because that's where I come from. And of course, having Max getting more and more into images and doing the research together with Lisa was a fantastic opportunity for me to also later bring in images and think in those type of terms and spaces, of course. But Max will talk more about that, so I won't jump the trigger on that yet. But let's talk about the audio, first of all. So one challenge that I realized I have to approach was to generalize. So I had to find very few parameters that I wanted to have as the center of my process. So it was a lot of try and error on my part, and I ended up with 3 main parameters that I wanted to use to process the sound part of the installation. And the first one is the balance between noise and pitch. And this is kind of the material in the sound itself, what it's made out of. Do you hear a noisy sound or do you hear a pitch-based sound? And in this case, since I work with environments that already have sound, I'm not going to generate it, but I'm going to use what I have. And then I use filters from the very noisy environment. I can then filter out individual pitches. So that's the good feature with filters is that you can do it seamlessly. You can go from the original sound and you can make it more and more and more narrow until you hear only one pitch. So in that way, you have a control over how much pitch and how much noise you will hear. I think in the patch, I use 64 different filters, so you can, in theory, get out 64 different pitches if you would like. Smoothness is another. So if sound is based on noise or pitch or something like that, smoothness would be more the surface of the sound. Is it a smooth or is it a more grainy sound? And that's something that I process as well. And then the final parameter, the third one, is the internal movement in the sound, which in this case is the speed of this grain, if it's a grainy sound. So those 3 parameters are at the center of the decision-making from the artificial intelligence for what will happen with the sounds when you listen to them. So to conclude, at times you will hear the recording from the environment as it was. You will hear the soundscape as it was, as if you would be in the middle of the trains or in the forest or something like that. And at times you will have something that's very processed and becomes very abstract. And then you have the whole scale in between. So you can take the thing I really try to reach is that you can put people inside this a completely realistic environment and slowly bring them into an abstract sound painting. So that was very important to have that slow process possible. Just showing you inside the computer again, this is the part of the computer that deals with sound. There are 4 speakers in the room, so you can see there are a lot of things that are 4 of in this patch, in this image. So every speaker has its own set of processes. I speak about 3 main parameters, but you can see there are a lot of more knobs than 3 in here. So there's much more happening, of course, but those 3 are those are the center of my attention when I try to make sense out of this, and the other kind of depend on them more or less. Then the next step is to go to video. So we have audio, and now we have to figure out how to relate the video to this. And in one respect, it's very easy. If you have recording of a lot of insects around the lamp, you will of course play sound from the insects themselves. And when a lot of those videos were shot, we did a separate audio recording of the same environment. Should mention also that a very important thing for both me and Max, I think, when we worked, was to refine the impression of where you are. So if you want to good sound, in my perspective, you want to erase everything that's unimportant, so to speak. So the clean recording is not always the best recording. If you want the sound of insect, you don't want that car that happened to pass by, like you really have to work on that, or you have a lot of other factors that you want to make sure that are not taking away from the impression of the pure idea of where we want people to be, so to speak. So in the audio processes, I felt forced to bring up three main parameters there as well in terms of video processing. And I realized very fast, if I didn't understand that before, is that there is no clear connection between how to process audio and how to process video. There's no perceptual clear way of doing it, I think. If you bring in pitches from sound, I don't know what that would be an image. I don't know what the equivalent would be an image. I can make it up intellectually, of course. I can come up with a lot of proposals, but I'm not sure it's universal valid. I actually think it's not. But that could be a discussion, of course. But what I came up with was a level of distortion. So when I think about filtering sounds into very small frequency registers, so you can hear pitches out of the noisy sound, then I think about that as a distortion of the sound. And in the video, we did similar process we did, maybe I shouldn't say similar. We also worked with distortion of the sound in the way that we worked on. One thing that was very important was the emphasis on motion, or so to only bring out the objects in the image that would move, or erase the motion. So you would erase everything that moves in the image and only keep the stable part, so to speak. And then, as you can see in the little image here, there are tendencies of pixelation, also distorted pixelation, that we work to kind of get more of the paintbrush into the thing. The other parameter is color processing. So we change colors in different ways. So we changed thresholds for the 3 color channels to make shifting colors in different ways. So that's also, of course, a distortion. And then I ended up with bringing number of overlaps. That's something that's very meditative, to see overlaps in motion. That you create a certain feel of time and space that I could associate with that existed in the audio as well. So that's a third parameter. But again, there's more to it. This is kind of the surface level of the patch, of course. I'll say a few words about the artificial intelligence before I leave the floor for Max there. So the computer takes all the decisions and it's based on logic and rules. That's the type of artificial intelligence I work with. It's usually called a constraint system. So there's a set of rules that I have to define. And then the computer, as being a very logic machine, is trying its best to follow those rules for what will happen next. And what the decision it takes is, how will we change all these parameters that you saw on those screens? Where will the knobs be next, so to speak? So it's a very abstract, symbolic way of working that gives a very concrete result in the audio or the images. A really interesting aspect of these systems is that there are strict rules that are based on logic, but there are also soft rules that can actually be broken. So there are rules that are kind of more wishes, so to speak. So you can say, I want this to be exactly like this, but then I would prefer it if you at the same time could do it this way. And sometimes that's not possible because of the strict rule. And then you create contradictions. So that's my last point on this slide. And contradictions are really useful in working in an artistic way, I find. Because if you make a contradiction, you say, this is what you can do. This is what I want you to do. I know you can't do it, but do your best to get as close as possible. And for me, that's desire. That's a desire of something you can't reach. And it can actually, in the good scenario, in these type of systems, be very, very powerful. You can make the audience hear where you're going, but they can never really go there. And that's the interesting aspect. There are a lot of examples of that in music. For example, if you give your students the task to analyze the music of Stravinsky, they will be really happy for 10 measures when everything works into a pattern and everything is exactly what it should be in their way of finding the system. But then very soon he breaks the whole system. And you would be so surprised, you wouldn't expect him to do that, but he's doing it all the time, which makes it really tricky to analyze because you're never sure if you got it. which I think is also part of the point, actually. And this last word about the form. So generalizing these systems. So I wanted to create musical form out of this. And there's, of course, lots that can be said about that, but just to give you one little insight. So I tried to find one simple parameter that would control everything. So I ended up choosing the parameter for the smoothness of the surface of the sound, so to speak, how smooth or how grainy is the sound you perceive. And then I make the system slowly go from smooth to grainy, according to this graph, and then the way back with a little dip in the middle. And this would affect, if I force the machine to do this, it will affect all the other parameters. So it will kind of it will relate to this, everything in some way that I wouldn't be able to predict exactly, actually. This is also a soft rule, the form, so it could be broken depending on what the other parameters allow me to do. So maybe the form will be more according to the orange line here, because it wasn't possible because of other parameters that just made it impossible. But it's a tendency to do this way, so to speak. Actually, I think I'll skip this for now. I'm going to end here. The side effect of the whole system, I was really happy when I reached a point where I could see that the system preferred to present concrete sounds, like realistic sounds, in one section of the piece where you can hear what it is, and then all of a sudden it switched to prefer more abstract sounds. So you get into these formal areas, which for me really relate to musical form. But I didn't decide this at all. This is kind of a side effect of the system. So when I found this side effect, I was very happy and tried to, maintain that behavior a little bit. And in the system, there are around 25 rules right now that's used to take the decision. So one rule might be very simple, but the connection of rules will make it very much more complex, because one rule will affect another rule. And if you have 25, you have a very complex network of rules. Each loudspeaker is controlled separately. So every speaker can behave separately. They do relate to each other. They kind of play tag a little bit with each other sometimes. So there is definitely similarities, but the machine takes separate decisions for each loudspeaker. And the video display, since I started with audio, the processing of the videos depend on the decision made for the audio. So the audio is in the center. And Max and I, when we discussed this, we cannot talk about it as a piece of music, even in the video aspect. So we see it as music in that respect. And I made an estimate. I think it will be around 400,000 decisions before we turn off the live stream today. So it's a lot. Every second, it's a new decision. Every second, the machine takes a new decision where to go next, so to speak. Okay, I think I'll step out and leave the floor to other perspectives from Max, maybe, Lisa?
That's great. Thank you very much, Orion. And I love this idea of the persistent sensorium of architecture and music as this bittersweet space of desire. It's beautiful. I also kind of like the idea of computers as extremely stupid, but you're showing us the kind of tacit intelligence that can be overwritten with bending rules. It's beautiful. Okay, Max, you're up. So Max is a fourth-year architecture student at the University of Manitoba. His interests in architecture are influenced by his background in music. He's a jazz musician. He's has records available, and I'll put a link to his website in the chat. So Max, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I have to start by thanking, of course, Arts, Letters, and Numbers for this wonderful opportunity, and also to Orion for letting me join him in this project. And then, of course, to Lisa for these incredible 2 years of doing research that are sort of beyond what I could have expected working for her as an undergraduate researcher. So I'm extremely grateful. So I guess I'll just begin by sharing my screen right here. And so, yeah, so I'll kind of pick up from where Orion left off, right here. So, so I guess to begin discussing what my contribution to Sonic Trails is, I think it's sort of interesting to begin this by discussing how musical experience is relevant to architecture. Musical experience, I believe, is not inextricably linked to sound as we typically think it is. Music is an abstract experience that as Ariane already described, is based on the way that our mind creates, finds logic in what it perceives, based on things such as rhythms, familiarity versus unfamiliarity, and so on. It is something beyond just sound. It is a complex structuring that happens in our mind based on what we perceive around us. Music is also something immersive that we find ourselves within. When experiencing music, we are required to be present in the moment. It's not an image that we can look at from the outside, but rather it is something that we are inside. We are always in the moment after what we previously heard or experienced and anticipating what will happen in the future. This all makes music highly relevant to architecture. Architectural experience, in other words, the way we experience our surroundings, is inherently a musical experience. The ways we find meaning in our surroundings, in architecture, is through the same logic we find meaning in musical sound. The meaning of both architecture and music comes as a result of our mind trying to make sense of its place at a moment in time. As Örjan and I began working together on this project, we also found ourselves under heavy COVID-19 restrictions, where public gatherings were fully banned, and thus urban spaces were almost fully devoid of people. Other urban phenomena that are not dependent on human presence, but regularly are in the background of the city, suddenly came fully into focus. And since there was nothing else happening, things like traffic lights changing color or cargo trains passing through the city suddenly became much more remarkable than they were before. We decided to use these environments as the audio-visual input into the installation. In Sonic Trails, the so-called lockdown city that is apathetic towards our human presence and often out of our focus is transformed and abstracted into a fully immersive musical architectural experience. Visitors find themselves present in urban qualities and processes that are often overlooked in the city they missed out on during the lockdown. So these environments were all sampled from across the city of Winnipeg. So here we see a range of locations where urban phenomena was sampled from. And so I guess in Sonic Trails, the opportunity of exploring this inherent musicality of spatial architectural experience, and particularly the musicality of this alienating lockdown city, arose from Örjan's artificial intelligence. As Örjan already described, this artificial intelligence is not thinking specifically about sound or image, but rather taking aesthetic decisions related to time and structure, without thinking specifically about a medium through which all these decisions should be experienced. And this sort of allowed us to explore how this musical structure could be perceived beyond a single medium. So because I was interested in somehow creating a spatial experience from these video samples that we had taken and the audio samples, we faced many challenges. Since I wanted the installation to become inhabitable rather than simply an image, we could not have simply projected some sort of video of these phenomena onto a single surface. Working with semi-transparent chiffon fabric and 2 projectors, I came to the idea of projecting the visuals through layers of fabric. 2 videos are projected, one from each side of the installation, and are duplicated and blended together on the layers of fabric. Visitors can inhabit these visuals, finding a place for themselves between or around this projected environment. The projected videos have also been edited, very heavily edited from their original format in order to make this setup possible. Let's look at one of the fan videos as an example, shown here, as we see on the map here at the bottom right. So in order to, if we simply projected this fan video onto the layers of fabric, it would be impossible to see through the layers. Light would cover the entire screens, making them completely opaque. Having experimented with light projections last summer with Lisa, I knew that when projectors project the color black, they do not project any light, while when they do project any other color than black, they do project light. I used this feature to create transparency. I cut out sections of the sample videos using black to create openings where no light would mask the transparent screen. In this process of cutting out these videos, I was attempting to create holes or spaces for visitors to inhabit between the visuals, as we see Örjan within this fan video now. And in this sense, the installation uses light as a material to construct the milieu, rather than in its typical application as an immaterial quality to illuminate space. So ultimately, in the Arc 2 gallery, the combination of layered semi-transparent screens, edited videos, and surround sound creates the immersive Sonic Trails environment. Visitors can wander and relax within this space as they please. Ultimately, visitors find themselves in the moment. Like any other piece of music or work of architecture, Sonic Trails is only really understood by experiencing it and being present within a space and a moment in time. So if we look here just at the ARC2 gallery, a plan view of the ARC2 gallery, we can see just the overall setup of the room. So here we see the two projectors that are projecting one from each end of the room. And then we also have the 4 loudspeakers, one in each corner of the room. And then we have the 3 streaming cameras that are streaming from different locations in the room. And when you're tuning into the live stream, you're seeing it's sort of the camera angles are switching between these 3 cameras seen here. And
Right.
so, yeah, I'll pass it over to Lisa.
Okay, I think you can hear me on my phone.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hey, Max, why don't you come and give us a tour?
Sure, yeah.
So we are here in the Architecture 2 building. There's the beautiful posters. And Max is coming out of 216.
All right, so I guess this is the first space you encounter when you're coming into the gallery. And then, so let's begin by going inside. So here, first we have to turn off the lights.
The installation is not that intelligent.
All right, so I guess the first thing you see are the 3 transparent screens that are being projected onto you. So,
And tell us again what the screens are made of.
yeah, so they're made of chiffon fabric that is semi-transparent, so you can sort of see through it. And then, of course, one of the main ideas as I played with the setup is that you're able to inhabit the space and sort of be between all of the images that you're seeing projected around you. And I guess the next thing we can point out is, of course, there are the 4 loudspeakers, one in each corner of the room.
Yes, which are a little dark.
Yeah, it's a little bit dark right now. But, and then of course, there's also the 3 streaming cameras that are shown in the plan drawing. One here, one up in the lighting rack, right up there, and then one right over there in the, getting the sort of frontal view of the whole installation.
Right. Right.
Is there anything else I can ask Ariane if there's anything else we should point out?
Yeah, sure. Or Oriane, I think you can hear us. Is there anything
Yeah.
else that you'd like us to point out, or does anyone have a question for us while we're in the
maybe
space?
show the screen of the artificial intelligence computer there at one end. It's in the space also. I think probably the screen is on right now.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my volume. To show the artificial intelligence screen in the
Right.
space.
Yeah,
So yeah, the
Maybe
artificial intelligence
more of the
computer
location of it.
is located right here next to this projector. So this artificial intelligence, the computer or the artificial intelligence in this computer is controlling everything else in the room.
Right. How do I adjust the volume?
I'm not sure.
There's the projector.
Was
Yes.
that a chair
So
I
think
saw?
we can probably move back into the.
Right. So I think we're going to leave, unless anyone else has a question for us while we're in the space.
What about the chair?
Oh, the chair. Well, Max sat in the chair a second ago. So the space in between the screens is the space of the chair.
Yeah, so the placement of the chair, we put one chair in the middle here so that when visitors come, they can have this opportunity to really sit and spend time in between all of the videos,
Right.
rather than just being on the outside all the time.
So there was a question in the chat, how many projectors?
2 projectors, so one projector at either end of the room. So there's one over there, and then there's one, I guess you can't see where I'm pointing right now, and then one at the other end of the room as well.
Right. So if I stand against the wall and there's the 3 screens and Max is in the space between them, one projector is at the north and the other projector is at the south. Yeah, and then maybe in this view, you can point out, come closer into the light here, Max, and then point to where the cameras are.
Right, okay, maybe this is a better way to see it.
And to speak up.
So there's one camera up there in the lighting rack. And then there's one camera also right here. That's giving us this view of the inside of the installation. And then there's one right next to one of the projectors, sort of giving us exactly the view of what the projector is projecting exactly.
Right, so
see through all of the layers.
So if anyone is on the live streaming, and can we tell when we're in the space which camera is live streaming at this moment?
We not in this space. You wouldn't know which one is live streaming at the given moment.
Right. But this is one. I'm holding my phone right above one of the cameras, and then it morphs from one camera view to the other.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
If anyone else has a short question, you can put it in the chat. I discovered that I can see those questions on my phone.
I can point out one thing, Lisa, that the chair in the middle is, of course, for visitors to experience sitting between the screens, but it's
Right.
also for other visitors to see the silhouette of the person sitting there, because we kind of inhabit the space by the visitors. There's no humans in the video, so the humans in the space become part of what you see, and it's an important part of what you see also.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's kind of social imaginary, right?
Yeah, I think definitely like the present, when someone is present in the chair specifically or walking between the screens, their silhouette becomes part of this image that you see. And that's sort of, I think, an important part also when it comes to the idea of creating a sense of presence in the space.
Right, and now I'm seeing that my shadow is superimposed on.
Exactly.
We're in the prairies. Anything else to point out or ask while we're in the space? Okay, so I think we're just going to transition to make things a little bit easier for us technically. Just 1 second.
And while they going out there, I can just mention that there are, for those who are interested, there are 4 computers in the space. So there is one computer for each projector, and there's one computer for the sound and the AI algorithm. And then we have one computer that's dedicated to live streaming. And I have to say, of all these technology elements, we struggled the most with the live streaming in the end, I think, because getting a good quality on live streaming is dependent on many factors. And but it took a little bit of extra work. And then the computers within the 3 computers that controlling the actual installation, they communicate via Wi-Fi. So they're all sending messages back and forth using this what's called the UDP protocol. And it's that very happy how well that technically works, so to speak. But that's a technical aspect.
Yeah, wow. And the technical and physical aspect worked better than I think we imagined. Thanks everyone for your patience with that. So maybe now let's bring Hans into the conversation. And Hans, maybe you have some questions and observations, and I'll just introduce you very briefly. Hans Huchko is a professor of music and the director of Harvard University's Studio of Electroacoustic Composition, or HUSIC, if I'm pronouncing the acronym correctly, probably not, but I don't know if HUSIC and music rhymes, but I like the ring of it. It was helping me in my intro rehearsal. But Hans studied music in Dresden, at the ERCOM in Paris, and at the University of Birmingham. He is a lifelong member of the Ensemble for Intuitive Music, Weimar. Hans has been sounding and teaching the limits and potential of musical experience globally for decades. Recent compositional works include Sparks and Liminal Spaces, and we welcome him to this international interdisciplinary dialogue with the makers of Sonic Trails Lockdown, and invite him to help us unlock the multimedia muses of immersive media. Hans, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me. And first off, congratulations, to this really beautiful project, and having created immersive installations and multimedia work myself with a lot of technology, I know what is part of this. So there's a lot of little things you have to figure out and a lot of big problems you have to solve. And I'm very happy if there's so much technology involved, I'm very happy to see that it actually turns into an emotional project and not some boxes, oh, we use this algorithm and we use that protocol and it all works at the end. So making it work be a quality at all. I mean, when we are in front of a piano, you're not amazed that it works. You're just taking that for granted. So I have a question. I do have a question for Örjan. I mean, I've known Örjan for over 20 years now. A lot of his research has been very influential to my own work, and I think we have been having a lot of very productive exchange over all those years. And one question, because I'm also very busy with artificial intelligence, and you just try to explain a little bit how you see it. So I have a very, how to say, very iconic image of what artificial intelligence is for me. So if I think about someone who has a very well outfitted wood shop, so you go into that space and he has all these machines and he has probably a wall panel full of tools. And that person knows exactly for this type of work, I need this chisel, and for that type, I need this file, and I need this saw, etc. So you have probably 30 or 40 different tools, and it is the human intelligence of that woodworker making the connection, what is the right tool at every single moment. When we're working with artificial intelligence, we have a separate network or a separate process for each of those tools. And that particular process only knows a very simple task, but has no intelligence beyond that. I mean, if you have a face recognition on your iPhone, it does not tell you what the weather is, because it's a totally different task. So we need the human intelligence, or what you described, I found really interesting, kind of an overarching one single parameter, which is then kind of guiding all these other 25 rules or processes into something where we get the impression that there is an overarching intelligence, but there is actually none. So it is, again, the human, it's you and Max, it's the creators of art who connect these individual tools and make something where we can fluently go from one to the next. So my question is more about time. Both arts are time-based arts. And we know if I'm a composer and I'm writing a 10-minute concert piece, or if I'm a video maker and I'm making an 8-minute video clip, I know exactly where I am in time. And I know exactly the angle from which the viewer would see it, or where the audience is sitting in the audience, etc. But we have less control over time, control about the perceived time, because we don't know when the person enters the room, how long, from which directions it sees the different things. So thinking about perceived time for a person who would visit the space, and how did you think about?
So the last part of the question dropped out, but I'll
how did you think who visits the space versus the timing for our streaming?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a very good question. Of course, a very relevant question. The time of the experience is in the hands of the visitor, so we lose control of that. Yeah, absolutely. So you have the good visitor and the less good visitor, so to speak, in my head. The really bad visitor is the one that peeks in through the door and closes the door, of course, because then they didn't even enter. And that can happen as well as on the live stream or in the space. And that's the game of that's the game when you work with installations. You have, I mean, in the Human Rights Museum, I knew who was, I mean, I was there not all the time, but most of the time, and we had it up for 11 hours, and we had 500 visitors. And out of those, you know, there are those, no one expected it there, so some passed by, and really happy with this older man who stayed for a full hour. That was fantastic. You know, that's really what impressed me somehow, because he didn't know what he walked into, so to speak. So you have the whole range. I think you can get, as a visitor, different benefits from, or you can get different impressions. So you can different parts of it depending on how much time you spend. I think the first impression is, I'm guessing the first impression is the images that are really beautiful when you come into the space. I mean, they're very imposing with colors and movements, you know, and some of the images are really powerful, especially the trains are really imposing with this big sound and the fast moving trains back and forth like the cars, you know. So that's very seductive, I think. And then you have other images that takes more time to experience, but the visitor who just stays there for a minute or so, that will be an impression. The imposing quality of the sound and images. Then if you stay for a longer time, then you start to follow the process, what's actually happening, you know. So it will take probably 5 minutes or something like that it depends on the AI, I would say, but I would say around 5 minutes I would give for at least discover that things are actually changing slow to something different, and something, it's not just random, you know, there is a process of trying to go from one aesthetic quality to another one. And if you would stay for 2 hours, then you would actually discover that, okay, I recognize this, I know this from before, but it didn't really play out that way before. So you get back maybe the train, but now instead of having it processed this way, it's processed another way, and it's overlapping with another image. So you get, of course, an enormous amount of variety, but you also get a lot of things that you actually can recognize, especially in the pictures. I think images are very strong for us to memorize and recognize. Sound can maybe be more abstract, depends, I guess, but not sure. So, you know, my favorite visitor would, of course, be the one that spends an hour in there.
Yeah.
And maybe it would be interesting for Max to also think about this, because of course for architects, the anticipation of the visitor is part of the design enterprise.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, of course, I think the idea of this ideal visitor, of course, if you only go in and spend like, you know, a minute inside there, you have to spend a lot to be able to really access the experience. You have to spend a lot of time, because if you just go in for maybe 30 seconds, you'll just be kind of interested in this sort of superficial image reading or the sound. So you might just sort of think, oh, it's like it's cars or something. But if you, to really get into this, because I think the thing that's really interesting to me about the experience is that you take these sort of the environments, but then they sort of become structured and they become music. And so the superficial reading, sort of the more time you spend in there, the more this like superficial reading becomes kind of irrelevant, and the sort of structured temporal experience sort of starts to emerge, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the possibility to change videos to something different, but still stay with the same piece, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the process of the images. But one thing with your work also, Max, of course, brings us to space, because it's not just, as you said in your presentation here, it's not just about images, it's also about creating space. Because this is something you unfortunately lose in the live stream, I think. But it is a three-dimensional space in the room itself, and you have this very, very striking illusion of things are actually further away and closer to you, because of the transparent quality of the screens and the way things are projected on different layers, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the often, you know, also a good visitor is someone who would explore the space, because the worst visitor is someone who peeks in for a second and doesn't enter the space and then leaves, because then you miss everything. Because a big part of the experience is that you're able to you're able to sort of see everything from different angles and experience the space, sort of the whole entirety of the space, because it, of course, is completely different. You experience it very differently depending on where you are in the space, which I think is one of the things that I found very interesting.
Yeah, an interesting architecture student, Ralph Gutierrez, who made one of the entr'actes, suggests that time and instance and position are kind of co-authors in the space. co-architects.
To experience space, you need time, of course.
Can I say something to that? We always think about, let's say, a visitor or a listener in our audience who somehow engage with what we are doing, or probably ignore the visitor which just opens the door for 30 seconds and leaves. It's almost like someone going to the symphony and knows that symphony is an hour long and leaves after 2 minutes. Well, then engage with. But let's think about a visitor who stays 5 minutes or up to 2 hours. So someone who starts engaging with it or engages through a long duration. Still, I have a question about what we call the change of timing change, the rate of timing change. So it's not about speed, because you have a lot of very different images between the farts spinning, the cars passing by, and then very slow movements. But I'm more interested in your thinking about the rate of change. So this kind of transition, how do we perceive change? And I had a beautiful experience not so long ago when I went to the North Adams Museum with a huge James Turrell exhibit, where he has this one light box. We see very, very slowly, gradually changing colors. And then this 8-minute cycle is interrupted with a moment where you get just bombarded with very fast flashing. So the kind of a total temporal contrast. And I was looking for something, do I feel in the live streaming moments where the overall experience accelerates or the overall experience almost comes to stand still? So are these timing things somehow part of your thinking?
It's actually a very relevant question, because what happened when we put this up on Tuesday is that on Wednesday we slowed everything down with 150%. I should say things that took 1 minute now takes 1.5 minutes for this reason. I mean, working in music, I think you agree with me, Hans. We become very sensitive to timing, because this is our most powerful tool, I think, in a concert piece. So how long how long should a piece be? You know, how long time should it take before something change? When do you get bored of things? You know, when do you need more input? All these things. So the reason why Max and I slowed it down was because we felt that it was a little bit too busy. You know, we wanted to be more of a meditative experience, I think. And then the other part of the question is, so it's up to the AI to change scenery. So if you're in the car scene, for example, and then it's going to shift to the grass in the front of the prairies, then when that happens, we do not really control. And it depends on several factors. One being that we wanted originally to hide every transition to another scene as much as possible. So we only change scenes when the processing is at its peak. So when you process the audio to just be pitches, because then you can't hear what it is anymore, or you have the image completely pixelated or something like that. And then we sneak by putting in another image, you know, people don't really notice until we kind of go back and zoom out, so to speak. And when that peak of processing happens, we can't really completely predict. So it could be 1 minute, it could be 4 minutes. So the speed of change of scenes, I think that's part of your question, you know, like that will be perceived as the speed of the installation. So, you know, it's funny, we have several students group coming in there yesterday, you know, first year undergrads, students or something like that. And it's interesting to see how they perceive it, because many of them haven't seen anything in this, looks like this before. So some people, you know, got stuck in some scene for 5 minutes and they were like, okay. And then others were really like changing all the time. So you get very different experiences on actually when you step into the installation, I think. There's a general behavior. The funny thing is we don't know what will happen, but I think both me and Max learned the behavior. So we know how the installation behaves at this point, but we don't know what will happen next, so to speak. So speed, I think speed and timing is really essential for how you experience this. So probably, we've been aiming, you correct me, Max, if I'm wrong, but I think we aimed for a little bit more meditative experience rather than you know, a driving force. But there are, I mean, we spoke about the trains and the movement in the trains, they are very powerful and they push you, you know, they propel you a little bit more than other things. So that affects how you perceive the timing also, I think.
Yeah, and a big part of the timing also is that we want to give the opportunity for people to get immersed in a specific moment. That, so for example, if something has suddenly become abstract, we don't want to get rid of the abstract experience before someone has the opportunity to really get into the abstract experience. So that was a big reason why we also slowed it down, was that sometimes things would be changing. You know, you get the trains and then they sort of turn into cars, but then immediately before you had the chance to really be there with the cars, it changed into just a bunch of pixelated squares. Mm-hmm. So it was really about giving enough time for people to get into these moments in the larger structure.
And I actually really like when the moments when the installation decides to not show what it shows, so to speak. It changed from trains to cars, and they all pixelated, and then it changed to grass, and no one even saw the cars before it went back. And that creates so pixelation as an example. But if that's the case, then people wouldn't even know there are cars, they just see the effect of it. So it changes colors, you know, and the movement you see in the pixelation still. So you might experience that.
Yeah.
But for some reason, the installation decided to never.
Yeah, like for example, you'd see the grass completely clearly, and then you'd see a bunch of rectangles flying by, and we know what it is, obviously, because we made the video, but no one else understands what these rectangles are. And then they disappear, but then, you know, way later, if you stay later, then suddenly you see that same movement that was just a rectangle, but now you see that it was actually cars doing that. Yeah. I think that's a big part of also like how it is creating a sort of musical structure, is that it's these sort of motifs, because for example, the movement of the cars horizontally is a sort of motif that's then coming back, and sometimes in different sort of ways. So sometimes it's just a rectangle, sometimes it's the cars, sometimes it's overlapped over a different image. And I think that's a big sort of part of how you experience time also.
And what about the space itself, like the Architecture 2 gallery? I know we had some conversations about where exactly it would be installed, and I know that you're thinking about taking it elsewhere. Like, would there be an iteration where the milieu of wherever it's installed might become a fourth screen, a fourth wall? And do you want to say anything about the attunements you made to the particular conditions of the gallery space?
I have one thing that Max, you and I talked about this recently. There is one space back in Sweden, which is a really old 18th century house in a big garden, which has huge windows, which is normally really bad for this because you want it to be in a black room. But one idea we have, we'll see if it all plays out, would be to have it set up there during the winter, because the winter back up in Sweden is pitch dark, you know. So you could have this and you can actually see it through the windows. That would be very, very nice, and use that as a feature rather than a problem. Of course, the gallery in Arc 2 is ideal in the way that you can make it black now. I mean, you helped us a lot, Lisa, with blacking out the windows that actually are in that space. But it's a very controlled, also acoustically very controlled space. So that's a different take. But I really like the idea of using the space that exists and not trying to raise a space. I really like the idea of finding a space and work with it. But of course, working with light, you know, you have to make the projections visible.
Yeah, like it would be interesting, because of course this gallery space, this is of course a very controlled gallery space. So there's not much in the space that's really putting any challenges on the setup. It's sort of, but it would be interesting as the next iteration of the project would be to install it somewhere where the space itself has some sort of very specific character that really has a big impact. So for example, like we were thinking originally about the CAST building here at the University of Manitoba, which would be a massive kind of warehouse space, which would of course change the way, for example, that you approach, your experience of the installation would be very different from here at the Arc 2 gallery, because you would approach the installation from far away in the room, or you'd maybe be walking on stairs high above. And this sort of the way that you approach the installation from outside of it is actually, I think, a really big part of the experience.
Yeah.
Can I make you a follow-up question exactly on that? I can't judge it for myself because I've not been in this space, but I can imagine that you open the doors and you're pretty close to those screens already. You see immediately these colors. And there is, to my understanding or to my imagination, a higher sense of getting and being in a first place in a large space first, and then seeing somewhere some screens and when walking towards them, and you have in your mind already, oh, this is just a little thing. So how is then your threshold of getting immersed space and you see actually these 3 screens from far away?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess when you first enter the space, you see, one of the interesting things about the installation is also that the way that the screens are set up, different angles make things seem larger or smaller. For example, if you look directly through all of the screens, you get this sort of perspectival effect that happens with the images duplicating, which makes it seem that suddenly the space is extremely deep in some moments. I don't know if Örjan also noticed this, but then if you look at it suddenly from the side, it compresses almost. There's this sort of effect that happens depending on the angles that you're standing in. The scale of the space changes. And that's, yeah, of course, that's a big impact. I don't know if Örjan has anything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The scale is a lot for images and also for sound. I mean, I am thinking about sound projection, you know, like you making a space sing is of course dependent on acoustics a lot, and how you play with acoustics and reflections, you know. So now the speakers are set up in a 4-channel version, but you know, in different type of space, I could think about having speakers playing the walls more, if it would make sense. I don't think it would make sense in this space to do that, but in a different type of space, definitely. I think I really like that, you know, like there should never be an obstacle with the space. We should rather find the qualities with it, I think, and work with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know you, Hans, I remember you you had this at Église Jésus in Montreal. Well, now it's over 10 years ago, probably. But that was also a very impressive use of space, I remember, because it's really reverberant space in cathedral setting. And I remember you had hidden the speakers, you couldn't see them. And you had this sound, very imposing sound everywhere. There was voices and singing and the organ in the back also involved in the space.
I think with any site-specific installation, we need to work with the space visually and acoustically.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, just from what I see today in the Zoom, it looks like you found a very good way of installing it. I mean, the next thing is also scale acoustic visually. So if you put that into a large space, do you think then to project it on screens which are 3 times the size, and therefore actually all the objects are blown out of proportion and everything is giant, etc. So there are so many aspects to it when actually the chance of immersion arises, and that happens really depending on how the space is. I had a totally different question for Örjan, coming back a little bit to strands are controlled. So you spoke about each speaker has its own control or its own process, and that the overall decision making in the audio is then driving the decisions for the 2 projectors. But I came across a few moments in this live stream where I felt such a strong connection between, let's say there was this fan image, and then you had a sound which would make this kind of left-right panning really quickly, and this etc. Then I say, wow, these can't be really totally independent processes on these 4 speakers. So how is this connected?
You're right. Okay, yeah. So there are secrets.
I want to know the secret.
So yeah, there are the 4 speakers. Actually, to be more precise, there are 4 channels that are processed separately. So there are four channels of sound, and then how they are projected on the speakers is actually a separate process. So yeah, I mean, if anyone here would figure that out, Hans, by listening, it would be you, of course. You figured out the code. So there are moments where the position of the speakers are moved around, you know, so if you're in the space, all of a sudden the sound would actually move from the other side. But there are also moments where the sound is projected around all speakers. So you get kind of a quasi-rotation, I would say. But every speaker is playing all the time. It's just that the sound samples from each channels are shifting, you know. So you can get that type of, I'm not sure if it's perceived as a rotation. It's rather kind of a more kind of a blend, which becomes really busy in a way. So, and it is a three-dimensional experience when you're in the space, of course. But in the mix, in the live stream, all channels are there, but you know they are mixed down with a little bit of reverb to recreate the space that actually in the space.
And I have one more question for Max. Most people working with video tend to think the primary medium, and then anything auditory is there to support what the visual world would suggest. How was it for you to work with images where the decision-making process lies actually on the auditory side?
That was a big challenge. I think that was something that because I mean, of course, it was Örjan's installation that was just audio, and then this next layer was added onto it. I think one of the interesting things that you perceive with audio visual is of course the relationship between what you see and what you hear is a really interesting feature that I think we were thinking about a lot, because, for example, I think that what you see is sort of when you're experiencing something audiovisual, what you see comes before what you hear, in a sense. Like, for example, if you see, let's say you see someone hitting a hammer on a nail, you'll first see the action, and then the sound will be something that comes as a result of what you see. I don't know if Örjan agrees with this reading. I don't like to talk to him about it.
Yeah, probably, you know.
But I think that's something I was thinking about a lot. And I guess the installation isn't thinking about that relationship specifically at all.
No,
but that was something that I think also with the choice of sounds and choice of visuals, trying to find specific sort of actions and processes that have this relationship that is really clear. Like, for example, one of the samples that I find really interesting is these water sprinklers, because they're of course the rhythmic, and you really get this, you really understand this relationship between that it's spraying water and you hear the water being sprayed, and then it's not, and then you see it as an effect of the motion. And also one of the things that becomes really interesting then is that when it starts becoming abstracted, suddenly you'll see that they sometimes fall out of sync, so that the water is spraying, but you hear the sound at a different rhythm, and then they kind of fall back into sync, or then they become sort of blended into a complete, just a single frequency that you just hear constantly. And so I think that if you're working audiovisually, you have to think, you can't think about the visual or the audio first, and then the other as a thing that you add as a sort of supporting role. I think it's more interesting if you think of it as this relationship between the two as being sort of the most important medium. I guess you could think of it as like action and how one of them reacts to the other.
So if you had the possibility of having a fifth computer in there, where there was some other agent taking qualities from the visuals and proposing feedback into, what would that be? What kind of things, what kind of decision makings or qualities in the visuals you would like to have an influence onto the audio?
I think actually, one thing I've always found interesting, I think it would be interesting to do this installation where maybe you don't add a fifth computer, but instead you flip it, because right now it's the audio affects the visual in a sense. But it would be interesting if we redid this whole AI from scratch, thinking about the fact that we're going to have it audio visual, and then we made it so that the visual, when something happens in the visual and there's an effect that happens in the visual, that's what affects the audio. Because I think it would be interesting to see, if I'm right also, if how the experience would be different if it's these things that you see that affect what you hear, that this relationship. Because I think that would be one of the things I'd love to experiment with in that sense.
Should say that, just to finish off the thought, when we did this rendering with the multimedia, we redid all the sound recordings So the material going into the thing was reevaluated and made from scratch. But I agree with Max. There's a lot of, what about the colors in the images? How would we relate to that?
I think also one other interesting thing to add is also the sense of scale that you get in the installation, that with the sound, everything, I think all the sounds are perceived as being relatively at the same scale because it's the same room with the sounds. Again, I guess sound doesn't really scale, like depending on if you record a sound really close. I guess it depends on the room, but most of the recordings were made outside, so it was the same outdoor scale. But with the videos, first it wasn't actually intentional, but then it sort of became something really interesting. I found that some of the things I would record would be, for example, like a downspout with water. I would record it extremely close up, but then I'd record the trains from really far away. And then when you're in the space, when you sort of inhabit it, suddenly the sense of scale in the visuals is really interesting, since you have something that is normally really small becomes extremely large, and then the trains that are usually really large, of course, become really small. And this playing with scale. And then as we kept moving forward, I kept playing with the sense of scale. I like the idea of purposely, I just thought it was really cool that you could take something really small and make it enormous in this setup. But then, of course, that's something that wasn't really translated directly into the sound either. There's not really a sense, like the downspout is not being heard at a different scale than the train. They're both just being heard.
And a nice observation that's in the chat here from architectural educator who happened to do his PhD on the relationship of architecture and music. He's saying that what the installation helps us enjoy is this monstrous indeterminacy of the in-between, of the concrete into the sort of palpable and recognizable. I think as well, there's something, monstrously immersive about the indistinguishability of what is visual and what is acoustic. Like, I think you're doing a good job of avoiding the chicken and egg relationship, which art comes first, architecture or music. Well, like if you think of the natal position, like wouldn't, you would, you hear the mother's voice before you see the face, right, as a condition. But this floating in the fluid, like something is felt. Immersiveness is a condition, the experience of which we're sort of born with. But Steve Parcell, I don't know if I'm taking your comment in a completely monstrous direction. You're welcome to turn on your camera and speak if you like, Steve. Or you can just let us go. There you are, Steve, go ahead.
Am I there? Oh, okay. Yeah, basically the comment in the chat was about how you recognize things. I did see an earlier, I guess, version maybe a few days ago, and it was showing the a kind of an abstract image and an abstract soundtrack along with that. And it was only after about a minute of watching it that I began to see the rhythm of train cars go past. I didn't actually identify it as train cars, so I was kind of put in this in kind of limbo, where I was perceiving things, but I wasn't conceiving them. So I mean that's why my question raises the issue of naming. And whether, let me just read this, like, do we see most of the images and sounds as distortions of things we know already? So that things that we don't know, we wouldn't recognize, and they would just kind of seem not an abstraction of something, but just inherently abstract.
I think it is, we're kind of looking at, I think the way that me and Ariane were looking at it a lot was that we're not interested so much in what, for example, the trains represent as a thing that you see in real life. We were more interested in the movement of the train. A big part, like, for example, every single environment that we sampled, we had the rule that it had to have a movement that would be interesting from an abstract aesthetic perspective. That, for example, the sprinkler, like, come back to that one again, that movement is extremely interesting just on its own, unrelated to the fact that it's a sprinkler, just this movement I found really interesting. So that was the way that we were connecting all the videos was purely aesthetic and abstract.
It's
And
also
then,
the choice of processes, Max.
yeah,
When we speak about the two main processes that we started off working with was erasing or emphasis movement. So you have an image of the train moving, and then you take away everything that's stable, so the movement becomes in the focus, you know. So that's a way of doing it, or the opposite way around. And I appreciate, Steve, the way you pose your question and reflections. I find it very fascinating when the point where things become abstract, because when you see the sounds, when you hear the soundscape and you see the image as if you were there, so to speak, in a realistic environment, and then the moment that, at least from the sound perspective, probably also from the image, they turn abstract, your brain works in a different way. Your time perception switches to another mode where your things are painting in a completely different way. And
I think
that really interests me. Yeah.
I think that's also what I was trying to say earlier on, is that that's the moment where you start understanding the music, when it becomes abstract. Because when you just see it as something you recognize, you're not looking for, you're so used to seeing these things that you're not looking for this abstract, this musical structure. But the second that it becomes abstract, as Örjan explains, your mode of thinking switches, and then you start just focusing on these abstract qualities like movements and specific pitches and sounds, and that's when you kind of get brought into the structure. And then I think when the visuals become clear again, you've sort of been brought into this new mode of thinking, and you're looking at it from a new way.
Yeah,
I think that's also really relevant to think about when you're making like buildings and architecture, that you think about how you can bring people into these sort of ways of thinking in buildings. I think that you're not thinking about just literal image and symbolic things, but it's a lot about these sort of abstractions to create these sort of experiences.
Yeah, I find another very interesting thought when I was watching the streaming from time to time, that for me it's another connection to the lockdown, to the situation we have been living through for the past 8. It has given us also the opportunity to reflect on memory. How do we memorize? How do we remember things we have done, we could do? Remember people, or remember situations which were very important to us and we have no access to. And so this kind of going from something very concrete and then going through stages of abstraction to something which becomes just a play of color or a play of slow movements, I found that very light of remembrance.
Yeah, like it's definitely, memory is key to, of course, understanding the installation, that you have to. And I think that's also one of the things that was interesting with this installation, that it really reveals the connection between both architectural experience and musical experience, is that they're both completely based on memory, is at least very central. That you have to be able to.
Absolutely, yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the way we teach music traditionally, it's all about memory. I mean, all my first-year students start to write pieces in AVA form, and it's all based on that you remember A from before, and that's how you make sense in music. And it's playing with memory and recognition, and that goes on every layer, even if it's more hidden and more complex than those simple things. I think memory and the function of memory, and that's a huge research topic. There's so many layers of memory, like there's many theories on short-term and extremely short-term and longer-term and medium-term memory. And I think they all have a very important role in music, how we understand things.
So this has been amazing, and I think we're approaching the end of the time, but I see that Ted Landrum has put some things in the chat and has sent me even more direct chat. So Ted, would you like to say something? And then I can turn things over to David Gersten if he's still on the call. Ted?
Yeah, well, I have a million thoughts as usual, and I've already, sent direct, points to Max, and we've had little conversations in the hall, and anyway, we could go on and on forever. It's so stimulating artistically, right? And I think the important thing for this conversation is to ask Lisa a question. about theaters of architectural imagination, and how this one really is like, it's in a gallery space, okay, but it's a gallery space inside of an architecture school, okay, and it's on the university campus, just a 2-minute walk from the music building, right, which almost was built right next to the architecture school, right? So the theater of the theater, okay, is something that's not really been talked about that much. It's like everywhere, all the world's a stage. We're in it, but it's an intense thing. And I just wanted to say also, like, I think Bahar is on here, and she's participated in the Sunship project, and you and Lisa collaborated with the conversation there about the process of making anything, and her students were making films while drawing and making things with light projected through translucent media like mylar and stuff. And so the event of making is itself important. And I just, it's a question, but I also just want to drop a hint. I think one of the things in the gallery that you really feel, and it was one of the first things said, is that it's like backstage. And having experience being on stage and backstage, you know, and many people have that. Not everyone gets that opportunity, but it's very magical to be in the side stage or the side wings of theater, and there's a space of performance and the magic of everything that theater is happening right there, but it's sort of pointed in a different direction towards the audience. And you're backstage as a facilitator or maybe waiting to enter and all nervous, you know, and that's like that space where you're, when we brought students in just yesterday, I think they were reluctant to walk out there because it's on stage, they're being projected to Venice. But anyway, there's on and on. This is a very long conversation. I think the question for Lisa is to talk about the teaching aspect, and for Max to talk about the learning, the event of learning, the eureka's.
Oh, well, I'll let Max say something if he likes, but I will say that the idea of integrating theatrical arts into architectural education is the entire topic of Act 4, heuristic. So stay tuned for that in November. But Max, if you want to add anything, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a tangential answer, but I think one of the interesting things about this installation too, if you look at it as a performance, is that it's the setting that is the performer. And that was something that I was interested in last summer when I was looking at someone like Josef Svoboda, the Czech scenographer, who was, a lot of his writing is very interesting, but on sort of the performance of settings. But I think this installation is, of course, people become part of it when they enter it. So yeah, everyone who's a visitor becomes, in a sense, a performer, but it's really about the place that you're in being the performer. And I think that's something interesting to think about. That's something important to think about when you're making real architecture too, is that it's not performers that are only performers, but it's the places where you are that are also performers.
I think that's a beautiful way to end, Max, sort of appreciating the agency of the milieu, which you've done through the reading of environmental sounds, but also through the reading of architecture. And Hans, thank you very much for the conversation. And I think we could do an entire session with your work as well. I've really enjoyed looking at the installation work on your websites and seeing the involvement with constructed elements that have performative aspects in the space. Percussive, I'm thinking of a particular one. Okay, I think David Gersten is off the call. So on behalf of Arts, Letters, and Numbers, unless Duwin would like to come on and say goodbye, I will thank our artists, Orion Sandrid and Max Sandrid and Hans. And thank you everyone for joining the Sunship, the Arts, Letters, and Numbers contribution to the CityX virtual pavilion of the Venice Biennale. And Duwin, thank you very much for all of your help backstage.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lisa, of course. Thank you.
Yeah,
for-
thank you, Lisa, and
for-
thank you, Hans, too.
Yeah, and Hans, very appreciate that you were on here also, Hans.
Congratulations, everyone. And thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah,
Nice to see you,
congrats.
Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.